Hello everybody, welcome back to Talking Tricks. Today I'm joined by Jason and Bryce as always. And today we're discussing a sparsely discussed topic in tricking. And that's the other appendages that aren't our lower extremity. Right? This is our upper extremity. We rarely
Exactly. We're not talking about penises today.
Well, maybe that appendage too. We'll eventually get there. But it's absolutely part of the tricking lexicon. But yeah, our upper extremity. We rarely talk about how to name tricks with our upper extremity. We're just like, yeah, you touch down, and that's about it. So because of the lack of theorizing, I think that this is somewhere we could break ground. And so that's what me, Bryce, and Jason set out to do. And Jesus Christ, we started probably almost a year ago now. And
scared ourselves away from it for that fucking entire year, basically. So, to give you guys an idea, our first approach, what we realized was we had a massive problem in our hands, and we decided to go attack it in like probably one of the dumbest ways possible, which was to just try to find an over-precise terminology that can describe everything that we could then go and cut stuff out of to trim it down. That was way too unmanageable and probably should have been obvious to us from the outset. So we sort of, revised our strategy. And so instead, we've got a bunch of limited areas of different hand terminology that we have identified that we're going to lay out clearly and concretely and then discuss potential solutions to those problems rather than tackling the entire thing all at once. So we, can at least potentially have a chance of doing it right.
Yeah.
So
to get into more specifics about what we were doing before, we were definitely brute forcing the problem in that like if there was a math problem and it had like a million different variables, we were just plugging.
We were just checking every single possible answer. Yeah. So that wasn't really smart. And once again, it probably should have occurred to us sooner. But after doing there and sitting around and doing some thinking, we identified a particular problem that we think we are in the position to actually address at the moment. And that actually has to do with the terminology arising around touch up, touchdown, sailor, essentially putting your hand down for a brief moment during an otherwise inverted trick. And the moments when you do that, which hand you use, and what trick it then leaves you doing as a result. For one thing, there's some gaps in terminology, which we're going to explain, but they're sort of at two different levels. One of them is at a slightly higher, more meta level. And I want to mention that one first. So we have two terms. We have inverts and grounded inverts, flying inverts. I've been calling them here amongst our conversations, and grounded inverts. Now, amongst grounded inverts, at least in the way we currently describe them, we actually have two different sorts of tricks. One of which we're going to be talking about today, and the other one we're not going to be talking about. One of them is a fully grounded invert, and that is the case where your body never leaves contact with the ground throughout the entire trick. So at some point during the trick, either your hand or your foot or some other part of your body is in contact with the ground. If you're doing a trick like this is a fully grounded invert. Think your well done cartwheel and Gumby, where you're not ever having like an actual air gap where you're hopping into it. At every single point in the trick, your body is in contact with the ground. Versus something like a Sailor Moon, where this is theoretically also a grounded invert because it's an invert where you are touching the ground. But there is actually some airtime in this trick if done properly. This is what we've been calling amongst ourselves partially grounded inverts. So in actuality, if we are going to split these things up into distinct classes, what we really have is flying inverts, partially grounded inverts, and fully grounded inverts. And so it is partially grounded inverts that we are going to be talking about today, things having to do with touch up, touchdown, sailor, and so on.
Exactly. And the reason why we're focusing on the partially is because we have some language that has started to develop surrounding that you can kind of mix and match with other tricks. Versus with, like, for example, cartwheel, it's a cartwheel. Like,
yes.
That's, you know what I mean? So
fully grounded tends to the tricks that are fully grounded at the moment the name of the trick conveys the information on what your arms and hands are supposed to be doing during the trick at the moment.
Yeah.
So we don't really have a gap there that necessarily needs to be filled. Something to talk about in the future for sure.
Exactly. Like, think of your Transformers. It's like we're not gonna discuss the intricate hand part of Transformer. It's a Transformer, and if I say that word, you know what pops into your head. So, yeah. In terms of partially, it's very easy to generalize some of the things that we've talked about in the past, and so that's what Bryce was getting at with the sailors, with the touchdown. So. The touchdown is probably the most universal, I would say, in terms of we've used it for so many different tricks. Like you can touchdown rise, you could touchdown B twist, you could touchdown full, and essentially everyone will know that you're saying, okay, your plant side foot, you're putting that hand down at the end of the trick. So that's pretty generalizable, right? And then we got touch up, which, this one's a little weirder because we always think of Sailor as kind of like a touch-up movement, but this one we've allocated to a left-sided touch-up. I'm trying to think of examples where like touch-up is actually used in like daily language. Can you guys think of any? Because I can't even.
I mean, any trick, touch up V twist I've seen a couple of times. There are a couple of different tricks that are slightly more amenable to touching up with your left hand than your right hand, but
Yeah.
it's I don't see it coming up all too often. All I do know is that that's generally the way people up until now have established the difference between touching with your right hand versus touching with your left hand in the beginning of the trick.
Right.
And it's anyway.
It's also just a way to differentiate from Sailor. And so right now we're talking in generalizations, and we'll get to like I guess more specific language for these things because right now let's go to Sailor. Sailor is like a right hand touch up essentially.
By touch up and touchdown, we're using these words now without saying what they mean.
That's
generally it's meant to refer to when it is your hand goes down in the midst of your flip, right? We've said that these are partially grounded inverts, meaning your hand is not on the ground the whole time. And if your hand is not on the ground the whole time, that means there's going to be a time when it is on the ground and when it's not. Hope that one didn't go over your guys' head or anything. But yeah, so so based on when your hand is not on the ground, that determines whether or not you're doing a touch up or touchdown. So, or rather, when your hand first goes onto the ground. So, if your hand hits the ground before you've made it to the peak of your height for that trick, we consider that a touch up. And if your hand comes down after you've made it over the peak of your height for that, and height, I mean the peak of your jump, right? Whenever you jump, you're gonna make it up to highest point, and you're gonna start coming down. If you put your hand down before or after that, that determines whether or not you're doing a touch up or a touchdown style trick.
Yeah. And very often you're with the touch up specifically, you're going to see that essentially as you're taking off because it's very hard to take off touchdown before you reach your peak and then continue with the rest of your trick. But these are just rigorous definitions that we came up with so that you can for sure differentiate in every case what is going on. And I'll get to some interesting cases that come up because of this theory in a bit. But right now I just want to finish doing the touch-up touchdowns. So, yeah. So we did Sailor, we did touch-up, and we did touchdown. Now we have right touchdown, which there is some precedent for in a way, but at the same time, so broken is typically used for right touchdown, but broken also insinuates an extra thing, which is landing on your right leg and kind of, I guess most of the time doing a hook, but it just really depends on how people do it. So there might be a better term we can use for broken for right touchdown, but as of now, that's
this is actually something we talked about that might be slightly controversial, which we'll get to in a little bit. But yeah, so right touchdown is not broken because what should be insinuated by the way you're coming down. We kind of talked about this in our meetings before, but trying to do a touchdown or a touch up
Mm-hmm.
as you're coming down to your front sides, like say you're doing a front flip. All right, do a front flip touchdown,
Mm-hmm.
or with either your right leg or right arm or your left arm. It's going to be really, really difficult because your head is going to be coming up and away from the ground
Mm-hmm.
as you're coming down from the peak of your height. Your body's not going to be really in the shape. Now, you can kind of get around this by dropping your side down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one way that people end up doing brokens. But that seems like that might end up requiring slightly different terminology because now it's kind of a different thing than simply just following your direction of momentum and then putting your hand, either down straight in front of you or up straight ahead of you.
Right, right. So, yeah, I mean, that's what we have so far in terms of the sailors, the touch up, the touchdowns, and, a way that you can very unambiguously talk about these things if you want to be, like, really trick nerd about it, is just say right touch up, right touchdown, left touchdown. It doesn't add too much more to what you're saying. For example, you could say RTDR or LTDR, and people understand what's going on there.
TDR, you probably will be able, like LTDR, there's probably still not going to be necessarily a reason for most of the time, just because if you say TDR, people will understand you mean LTDR. But now, if you are someone who actually does like swap hands for whatever reason, you can say RTDR and everybody will actually know what the hell you mean. And it doesn't take you 3 years longer to say it.
Right, right. I'm trying to picture an RTDR and it looks so awkward. but at the same time, I could imagine someone doing it in a clean way that looks cool. So
I see that done more as like right-handed Gumby usually, where people do it as a fully grounded invert rather than a partially grounded invert. But yeah, I'm sure it can be done to great effect.
Really quick, Bryce, I actually did want to address that specific trick because I have heard some people refer to that one-handed Gumby type of thing as a sailor. Like
that doesn't fly with our not only does it not fly with what we established here, but it also doesn't really fly with what a Sailor Moon actually is.
Right. Well, sailor refers to a very specific way to do a rise, and so I've heard it either called a Sailor Moon or one-handed rise or a
Anybody
Gumby.
anybody calling a right-handed Gumby a Sailor Moon is just wrong.
Well,
Rise for President.
And he can mathematically prove you wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I will start by doing that.
Yeah. But yeah, essentially with the Sailor Moon argument, within this theorem, it would be a fully grounded trick. So it would be described by saying one-handed Gumby. So, yeah. Which is also interesting because what happens if you do a TDR, but it's like fully grounded?
So it wouldn't be a touchdown rise anymore. It would be a left-handed Gumby, which is totally theoretically possible. The only reason why it would be difficult to do is because it would require you to be very, very flexible. You would have to be an incredibly bendy boy. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be honest with you. I've actually tried to do that for a very long time, and I have had very marginal success. Yeah. I'm sure someone can do it if they get slightly bendier, but
right.
I've always had to do a teeny little hoppy hop.
Yeah.
In my touching rise.
Yeah, maybe you have to treat it like a master scoot instead. Then it'll be possible.
Yeah.
Good thing
I don't know if
TDRs are.
Has that come out yet? Hey, in case it hasn't. Just in case you guys don't know, your touchdown rise might be a master scoot.
Yeah, keep an eye out for that video because you're doing master scoot. There's no such thing as TDR.
There is such thing as TDR. It's just the legends foretold that one day it would come over the mountaintop, and
right.
Who knows?
Right. So yeah, essentially we're trying to lay down this groundwork to talk about hand stuff without fully coming up with a concrete theory of everything with hands, because at this moment, like, more ideas need to form about it.
Yes. And hand stuff is too complicated for us to just show up and like have a great idea for everything. There's stuff like 1990s and 2000s, which we frankly just don't have any idea how to deal with at the moment. But I'm sure in the future somebody will have a good idea. Well, we have some idea for certain problems that existed previously, like tricks like double Gumby exist, but as soon as spinning around on your hands twice on the ground is considered just one trick, then that means something like air flare theoretically should also be like one trick if you do 20 of them in a row. But that doesn't really make sense with the way that we build combos. It should be that the first thing that you did to start off your air flare combo, the swing up into the air flare, that should be a trick. And then you should be doing hand vanishes essentially between each and every single one of your air flares until you land.
Yeah.
So that, there are some bits and pieces where we have some ideas. But
that's the best way we have to describe it right now, which isn't great. It's just like essentially air flare is like you say air flare and someone does an air flare, and you say like maybe. So something I learned actually when I went to Oregon, I talked to someone, and they talked about how good or bad people's theories of whatever sport they do are, and they said that breakdancers or b-boys are notoriously bad at naming everything because they just don't. They're just like, oh yeah, he did this dance move and then he air flared and then this but he did it with his foot touching the ground, and you know what I mean? Is they just verbally describe it instead of actually coming up with some kind of
with an actual terminology for it, and so now it's just like this horrible mishmash of confusing shit. Yeah, let's like try to avoid that for tricking, guys. Let's really do our best to not have that happen.
But I mean, I think my point with that is though is that there's a lot of hand stuff in b-boys, and I think hand stuff might just be like inherently difficult to describe because it fucking is. Like I don't like there has to be a way though. No, you're right, because if we could describe tricking with its complex leg movements, I think there's definitely a way to do that with b-boying. They just suck at doing that. So calling out all the b-boys out there.
Currently we also suck at doing it, but we're trying to suck less. We're trying to get better.
Yeah, well, part of this is definitely going to be help from the tricking community. So hopefully you guys listen to this and shoot some ideas, and we can come up with something together, because also the tricking community is what determines what things are named at all times. So,
Yeah, and if you've got like a gut reaction to something, that doesn't necessarily mean that's an awful thing. Like if you can find a good justification for that gut reaction, that might just be like your trick or gut reaction coming up. Like when I say now that double Gumby isn't one trick, it's actually a combo, because that's the implication of all of that shit that I was saying a second ago. Double Gumby is not one trick. It's actually a combo. The first thing that you do when you swing yourself up into the double Gumby, that's one trick, and then you vanish around to the second one. Or, well, actually, I think you might even redirect around to the second one. I'll have to sit there and think about it a little bit more, because I haven't broken it down for a while. But it's not one trick, which is what deals with that an air flare being like a 20 times air flare or 15 times air flare, depending on how many times you do them. So
I don't even know how you count that shit. But that's also a very philosophical question, Bryce, is at what point does the trick end and become another trick, or at
the moment we have it has to do with how many steps that you take in between it, or basically like whether it has to do with steps / leaving the ground. So you can theoretically either take 3 steps or you can hop off the ground. So you can you could rapid, you could not take your 3 steps, and that's still considered a transition into a new trick. Or you could redirect, take your 3 steps, and now you have to be doing a new trick after this, otherwise your combo is going to end.
Yeah. Well, because my initial thought when I think about hand stuff is that with tricking, because everything is centered around the legs, I'm like, okay, the moment you take your legs off, you're doing a trick, and until your foot touches the ground again, you're still doing that trick. And you're not, you mentioned doing like transitions between them, but in the way it philosophically plays out in my head is that this is all one trick, and we can if steps of your feet and airtime that is buttressed on either side by your feet touching the ground, if that's the only thing that can end and start new tricks, then that's the case. Then if someone swings up into air flare and then does 20 of them, that was a 20 times air flare that you just saw, and not 20 air flares that were being vanished between. However, I think that would be I think the result of taking that slightly more, that is a simpler approach to what it means to distinguish 2 tricks, right? You've made the number of cases in which you can distinguish 2 tricks much smaller, right? It only has to do with your feet, only has to do with these steps, only has to do with these transitions. Okay. But in doing so, you now also make the existence of 20 times air flare, 21 times air flare, 22 times air flare. All of them are now tricks in the Trictionary instead of just air flare. That's a true
which is
point. But they could all just fall into the subsection of air flare, and it's just like one
sure,
times or two times or three times. I don't know. That's how.
sure, but here's the thing. It's like, all right, what if someone one day actually does an actual double air flare? By which I mean they vanish from one air flare and then fucking spin twice before coming back down to the ground. Now
that's
you're
a
gonna have to
separate
come up
trick.
with
Yeah.
new fucking terminology for double air flare and ×2 air flare. It's just gonna be a pain in the fucking ass.
You just
There's
use
no
in-out terminology from gymnastics, okay?
yeah.
That's what we do with
It,
everything else we don't know.
it just makes sense in my opinion. And once again, this is
Yeah.
something that I want to hear more people's thoughts on. If you disagree with me, tell me why you disagree with me. But
Yeah.
I think it makes more sense to just homogenize between hand and feet what allows one to distinguish between two different tricks. Like I mentioned before for double Gumby or for breaking up air flare spam into combos.
Yeah.
It just, if you take 3 steps and or you do a transition that leaves you taking off into the air again like a rapid, then that's what ends your trick, and it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not it's your hand or your feet.
Yeah.
That's touching.
Well, the other interesting outcome of my theory that I just postulated is that it counts as a trick if I like go onto my hands and just start like walking casually on my hands. Like
yeah, absolutely.
That's a trick.
Here's the thing. This is another weird consequence of this system is the transition from your feet to your hands, literally just doing a handstand. That is a trick.
Yeah.
And it has to be. Because if it's not, then cartwheel can't be a trick because you've done 4 steps consecutively.
If you take off your right leg, it's a rise type of handstand trick, like just by definition. So
it does belong to the rise family technically. Yeah. So yeah, once again, if you don't like any of this, tell me what the better alternative is. Because at the moment, not doing this means that you have to deal with double air flare and ×2 air flare, and both of them have to be in your Trictionary. And it's awful. And this, I bring up air flare. There's going to be lots of other hand tricks which have something very similar like this going on.
Yeah.
And so for the purpose of making the names that we can use to describe them simpler and less ambiguous, I think that this is the better answer. But I could be wrong, and I want to hear more. Okay, that's enough about that.
Well, no, it's not. I want to bring up one more thing. I'm sorry.
No.
I think you brought me a little bit more over to your side because your side opens up the idea of tricks that exclusively use your hands. And what I mean by that is we've seen the people on Tramp who will do a hand backflip where they start on their hands and then they backflip onto their hands again.
Yes. Oh, people can do that on floor, actually.
That's crazy.
Yeah, but Bryce and I have kind of talked about this, and we decided that there's a problem with this, and it's that you don't walk into the gym on your hands and you don't leave the gym on your hands. So that hand backflip is a part of a larger trick that includes first getting to your hands from your feet and then from your hands to your feet again.
Exactly. It's actually a combo because you had to get to your hands. You had to, after you landed the hand front flip, you then had to get back to your feet. Right. So that was technically a combo.
Okay, but isn't a combo constituted by tricks? Like, I'm kind of confused what you guys are saying. Like,
no, he's saying that you cannot just do a hand front flip as a one hitter. It's impossible to just do a one hitter.
Right. You first have to get into a handstand.
You have to rise type handstand first, and then
you can it's a move that you can literally only ever hit in a combo.
That's interesting.
It's impossible to isolate it.
That's a good point. What about people without legs?
Okay, well,
I think they have other concerns besides trick theory.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that we are going to be able to come up with a language that can accommodate all potential body plans.
You guys are so ableist. It hurts. Actually.
Tricking is ableist by its nature.
Well, what if there are aliens that have fucking 4 legs? Have you guys thought about that yet? Jesus Christ.
Well, since the government has pretty much confirmed it,
Look, here's the thing. I believed in aliens right up until the American government said they might be real, and now I'm kind of iffy about it.
That's a good point, actually. Oh my god, yeah.
As soon as they start saying, you guys can believe in this, I immediately start getting suspicious about it.
Yeah. So. Dude low-key sounded sus in the Congress hearing, but I don't know. That's just me. Anyway, you wanted to move on from this, Bryce, and I didn't know.
I felt like we had beat the dead horse. But if there is anything else anybody had to say about it that they think really has to get out, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that in our planning meetings for this episode, we had discussed that these those like tricks open up like essentially just a sub combo. And it
Mm-hmm.
kind of relates to what I had just explained to you, Frank. Like you don't enter the gym on your hands and you don't leave the gym on your hands. You don't drive home in the car on your hands.
Mm-hmm.
So like, that is what allows things like hand transitions to exist between hand-based tricks such as Gumby and Air Flare and
Mm-hmm.
Cartwheel and stuff, right? That's how those kinds of things are allowed to exist, or hand transitions more or less are allowed to exist. Just because hand
Mm-hmm.
combos, which is like a subset of combos that can occur in a traditional tricking combo dominated by feet-based transitions,
Mm-hmm.
like, so
And
essentially just that.
yeah, and we've theorized that this is like in our really long planning episode, like how we could name hand transitions. We're not going to get into that here because it is a very tall order. So for now, we're just leaving it up to, there's a potential to like name it a transition. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
well, there's two broad possibilities that come to my mind for the moment for how we could approach it, but
Mm-hmm.
we haven't even begun to discuss which of them is the correct one, much less actually go and give things names.
Yeah.
And those two broad ways of doing it are hand transitions and foot transitions are things that are fundamentally different,
Mm-hmm.
and or hand transitions and foot transitions are fundamentally the same. There's only one thing. There's just transitions.
Mm,
Uh,
yeah. So we
and
could
then
potentially vanish on your hands is what,
exactly.
yeah.
But then that would also mean like when you're going from your hand to your feet,
Mm-hmm.
that would also could theoretically be a transition, or we'd have to come up with new rules to exclude that.
That or it's
Oh.
the ending of a trick.
Exactly.
Just
If there is just transitions and there's no distinction between what your hands and your feet do, then going from your hands to your feet should also theoretically be part of it should be part of a step in
Yeah.
transition.
Well, if there's no
It's
termination,
not
there's no termination of a trick then because
I-
it's
like
just everything's a transition.
one of
no,
them.
I am the way I see it, and like a case we can look at for like a microcosm of this example is Double Gumby.
Okay.
Double Gumby features two Gumbies that are both hand-based and a hand transition between them,
Mm-hmm.
but the ending of the second Gumby isn't its own transition, it's the ending of the second Gumby.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of continuing to use your hands, you have terminated the chain of Gumbies, terminated the hand combo, and begun to, whether you terminate like the rest of the foot combo, that the hand combo is like a subset of,
Mm-hmm.
then, then you've terminated both the hand and foot combo. But just because, you have ended or you've gone from you've ended the double Gumby combo and you've like, you're back on your feet now, doesn't mean that you can't continue forward or
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
jump
you have-
into like another hand-based combination. But essentially, like when you coming to your feet, the way I see it is just the ending of the trick chain that you're doing with your feet, and then you could also then go into another double Gumby. Like you could do double Gumby, vanish, double Gumby, but I know double Gumby is not necessarily the name we're going for, but just as an easy way to reference it.
I haven't come up with what the actual name of the two different tricks should be.
Gumby times two is probably more efficient, but
That has the exact same problem. It's because
it
there's
definitely does. Yeah.
two different tricks. It's one trick vanish the second trick is what it should actually be called.
Gumby hand vanish, Gumby.
Hand
and-
vanish.
But they're both kind of like, yeah, they're both closely related to Gumby. Like the first one is downright damn near precisely a Gumby, but the second one is more of like just you spinning around on your hands.
Yeah.
Not the same. But I don't have a name for that. It's like Gumby vanish pirouette on the ground. But pirouette already is a thing that you do on your feet in ballet, so it's probably not the call it that. That's just what I've heard people call it before.
I'm getting flashbacks to us initially planning this and how
But yeah, exactly. I'm sorry.
how
Look,
cursed everything is.
possibilities
That's bad.
that we have at the moment,
Mhm.
neither one of them looks really great at the moment to us for
Yeah.
different reasons. Talk about that amongst yourselves. Hit us with it if one of those is very obviously more appealing to you guys for some concrete reason. Let us know. We're interested.
Yeah, yeah, because we
Yeah, the
do-
main idea of this episode is to just kind of get this concept out there. It's something that we recognize as an issue in tricking or a place that we can expand,
Mhm.
and that just isn't being addressed by a lot of, even mainstream terminology like facets like TKT and other things like that. So,
Mhm.
everyone's kind of neglectful of hands, and there's a lot of area, like a lot of potential that, we're clearly expressing, by all the things that we're highlighting here, but
Yeah.
just no one's really talking about it. No one's like trying to lay it out. And it is a huge undertaking thus far, so
Yeah.
you know,
It
just trying to get the groundwork established.
it feels like it feels like we're trying to come up with like some kind of grand unified theory of something because like hands is obviously a very essential part of tricking and we have to be able to describe that. And right now we have like the trick theory we've come up with so far, which is just like fucking general relativity or something like that for the risk of us sounding too grandiose. But and then we have this, which is like the baby steps of quantum physics, and we got to find a way to marry them, and it's so hard to do that, and I think that's the difficult part personally, because I could sit down here and I could come up with some hand stuff all day long if I really wanted to, but the intersection between that and interacting with foot tricks is where it becomes so messy. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's really the kind of the wall that we've been running up against over and over and over again as we've talked about this. And it's actually I was only half joking when I said much earlier that it scared us away from doing lots of trick theory for a while because we haven't really been discussing as much like actual theory around here as we probably ought to have, because essentially we started talking about this a long time ago, and we realized that we lost all hope after we confronted ourselves with how big the problem was. It's a lot of complexity, and it's not like it's avoidable. It's not like the complexity is necessarily just an artifact of our approach. Part of it was, and we've gotten rid of some of it, but a lot of it has to do with what Frank was just saying a second ago. There's just a lot of complexity inherent to the system that we're trying to describe right now, right? All of the various ways that you could put together, at least simply, tricks where distinguish them based on what your hands and feet are doing. The more fine-grained we get with this, the more complex the system is necessarily going to be, and the more we're going to bang our head against our desk as we try to figure out what the hell it is.
Yeah.
So
exactly. But I think it will open up a lot of really cool tricks to potentially do that we've never considered because we have a very limited understanding of hand stuff. So,
that's the eventual goal, is to be able to write down and express ideas for tricks and combos and combo elements and so on that previously, while you could theoretically imagine them, one person out there with the creativity could come up with them. If they don't necessarily have the ability to perform that trick and then record it, then their ability to communicate it to others is incredibly, stunted. And it's been many a day, I'm sure, where you've had a cool idea for a trick that just doesn't necessarily live in your style or in your skill regime yet. And it would kind of suck if that was the only time anybody ever got to think of that trick.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, right now we're talking in broad stroke generalizations, but I want to bring us back to some specific stuff. And so one interesting consequence of coming up with like the touchdown and the touch up thing is that works really well for frontside tricks like A twist and rise, where you can touch up before you peak and touch down after your peak. But when you think about backside tricks like cork or full or even just backflip, like how do you touch up a backflip? And so I think the thing we came up with is that like there's not really a touch up of backside tricks. It's just like all touchdowns.
It's sort of the thing that I was mentioning much earlier about like, how do you touch down a front flip? It's the exact same sort of problem here. Your chest and head are being brought away from the ground at the instant where you're supposed to be putting your hands down, according to the description of the trick. And in the case where that's what's going on, you could theoretically get this around by dropping your side down and putting your hand down sideways, which is the way that people get around this sometimes. But that seems fundamentally different to us. So we want to potentially...
Yeah, it seems like starting from the crouch position would be the only realistic way to kind of do like a touch up, essentially. But even then, that doesn't feel like a clean answer.
Scenarios where like somehow maybe so my scenario for touch up for a backflip has to do with low gravity. My scenario, actually, technically, I guess you could do both of them in low gravity. So if you want to do a touchdown on something that's going front flippy, something that's going to have you landing in front side, then what you could do is you could do a front flip in, front handspring out.
That's
and
what
so
I was
if you,
picturing.
that would be nice and easy.
I feel like I've seen someone do
nice
that.
and easy.
I honest to God think I've seen someone do that though.
I would be amazed. But yeah, and then similarly, if you wanted to do a touch up for a backflip for something that's taking off from backside, then yeah, you could do a back handspring in, back out.
Yeah.
And that would do it. You'd have to not jump very hard when you used your legs in the beginning, and then you have to jump really hard off your hands during the handspring.
Yeah.
Honestly, when fronted with this issue, I think we just have to accept that some tricks are unavailable to touch up and some tricks are unavailable to touch down. Like front flip, you simply can't touch down on its own, and backflip, you simply can't touch up. And
But
you know,
it has the caveat of what Bryce said. You can be over the side. Like reversal, I'm thinking, like, let's say you reversal with your hand at the end. Or even like broken. Broken is like you land facing front side. It is over the side, but I would still call that a front side landing trick where you could touch down. And
Types of reversals. The only one where you could potentially be considering it a touchdown is the one that's fully grounded, because otherwise it's a touch-up trick.
Well, I'm just picturing a reversal where you place your hand at the end, which I think is very, I think it's possible, personally. So I don't know. I do like that you brought up that example, Bryce.
Well, than some of the other examples that we've given, for sure.
Sorry, you broke up just a second. Can you repeat that?
Oh, my apologies. I said I think that's a bit more possible than some of the other things that we've suggested a second ago, for sure, because once again, I mentioned that there's two different versions of that. There's already one that people do pretty frequently where you do a fully grounded reversal, where you have your right arm just planted the whole time, come off at the very end. Yeah. So that's totally possible. So it is, I suppose, theoretically possible for you to do a right touchdown at the very end of the reversal. I haven't seen anybody do it, and I know that would be hard as shit.
Yeah.
I was going to say that earlier in the episode that right touchdown is probably the most like undone intentional hand variation or hand transit. I guess actually hand variation might be more appropriate. And I think mostly because it's associated with like not landing your backside 7, 10, etc.
True.
But in theory, and I know this is kind of breaking away from what we were talking about, but I wanted to get this out there. I think you could do a right-handed touchdown, landing in hyper and not necessarily doing broken, like by, using a frontside landing stance. Mm-hmm. But if you were to like backside or, full hyper hook, place your hand down and then push off with your hand and then finish your like full hyper hook, I think that would be an effective way to demonstrate a right touchdown.
I think even keeping your hand down as your foot is touching. I think at least personally for me, I think
that could work too. But
yeah. Because in my head, whenever I think of actual broken, that's what it is. While in practice, some people do touch their right hand down after their foot touches down. I think if you want a true broken, it has to be right hand down first, and then your right leg.
Well, I think even still, like based on what we consider the ending of a trick terminating with your feet coming down, like if your hand is placed onto the ground after your feet touch, like you just didn't land the trick. Yeah. Like that's not broken. You just didn't land, and that's kind of part of what makes broken difficult. It's like. Mm-hmm. That timing.
Jason has strong opinions about broken, or had strong opinions about broken.
We had some conversations about broken, and at one point, I think I had mentioned, this is just a hot take that you guys can and cannot. You can disavow me if you want. Feel free. But I feel like broken. There's two different ways to potentially think about it, and one of the ways within our framework essentially just makes it sort of like a front handspring out, a right-handed front handspring out. But that gets rid of sort of an aspect of what people sort of want broken to look like, where they're having that sort of come down to the side thing involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But once again, there's an aspect of this touchdown thing that has to do with your being sideways to the ground and your arms being able to just come straight out from your torso and touch down. There's something to do with that we haven't really fully pinned down yet. Mm-hmm. That should have its own name that distinguishes different touchdowns from each other.
Listen, I'm more of I like to group stuff together more because it makes it easier to talk in generalization. So I agree with you in the sense that like broken as we traditionally think about it and broken the way you described it where you're like front handspringing is essentially the same thing. And then you could talk about the minutia of what you actually did in like the variation section of your trick.
thing based purely on the distinguishing factors that we have worked into our terms at the moment, right? The things that distinguish touchdown and touch up from each other is when relative to the peak of your jump that your hand goes down in your partially grounded invert. Right to just determine whether you're right and left, obviously. But because of that, there's nothing in this system to distinguish broken from right-handed front handspring out. That's why I bring that up. That's why I mention it. It's like, yeah, we currently, in our current system, you could theoretically just consider broken to be just a very poorly done right-handed front handspring out. But that's not usually what people are actually trying to do, or at least I can assume that's not usually what people are trying to do when they do their broken.
Well, I personally don't actually find an issue with that being the case. Like, people can...
Okay.
I don't know. That's just me personally. I'm like,
But this, like, is that also your position on the trick broken, that everybody that we've been seeing it doing it until now has sort of been doing it essentially wrong, or at least not in the way be done most effectively,
maybe you're thinking of like the platonic ideal of a trick.
That's exactly what I'm thinking.
Okay,
like,
I see what you're saying.
Nobody has to achieve the platonic ideal, and everybody is different. Platonic ideals of different tricks are obviously all somewhat different. Yeah. But if the ideal is actually a right-handed front handspring out, that is like much different from when you look at most footage of broken.
Yeah. So, okay, my take on that is that we always have the textbook version of what something is, which is the platonic ideal thing you're bringing up. This exists for pretty much every trick, but I think when people stray from that, I still call it the same trick without, I don't think they're doing anything wrong, is kind of what I'm trying to get at. Is like they're just doing it in a different style, but at its fundamental level, it's still the same trick because it has the same aspects.
I totally agree with that as well, but I do think there's something important that's being said when the platonic ideal is never even slightly achieved, right? It's one thing when most people don't put in all the time and effort to achieve the full effects of the platonic ideal of like all of the various tiny bits of minutia, but they could do it if they wanted to. It's actually something that there is a reasonable path to start working down.
Yeah.
You've seen ice corks before.
Yeah.
That's a representation of our current platonic ideal for a cork. But you've never actually seen someone do the old mainstream style cork. You've only seen them do their attempt at the old mainstream style cork, which ended up having the flat spin in it and the flip in it that they were always trying to avoid because they wanted to just kick themselves up into one spot, spin around that one spot, and then come down afterwards.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is,
Sorry,
when no one ever achieves the platonic ideal, it's because the platonic ideal is wrong. Like in the case of the double D episode, where everybody has this idea that what a D leg is you rotating around an axis that goes through your torso up through your head. That's literally impossible. So that platonic ideal is wrong. And so it might be this platonic ideal is also wrong. But if this platonic ideal is suggested to us by our language,
our
language is giving us bad answers.
I see what you're saying. That you're like proving our trick theory wrong by demonstrating.
From our assumptions, yes.
I see what you're saying. I mean the only thing I would push back on that a little bit is that there's such thing as having a useful theory that isn't achievable because that's just how the language works out. It makes the language simpler. I don't know, in the same sense that, like, I don't know, physicists will ignore air resistance. It's like, okay, that doesn't exist in the real world, but it's still a useful tool to be able to determine the fucking velocity of this thing traveling through the air or something. I don't know. Like
the old mainstream explanation of cork, prior to people having footage of and knowing how to do cork the way we do it nowadays, having someone explain to you the old mainstream style of cork was much better than nothing.
Right.
For getting where we do cork nowadays is much better than nothing. What I'm saying is that it still requires revision, just like our old mainstream platonic ideal for cork.
Okay, you're saying that we could potentially come up with a better theory. Okay, I see what you're saying now.
It's got room for growth there. That's sort of obvious that we can point at. We can very clearly say where it is as a result.
Got it. Okay, yeah. Then if that's the case, I definitely agree with you. I think there may be a way in the future to describe it in a better way. But I think for now, this insinuates that the ideal is doing that front flip hand
Front hand,
touchdown thing.
front hands. So
Some
everybody who does lots of brokens, who I'm sure either disagrees with that, or maybe there are a couple of you out there who fully agree with that. That would surprise the hell out of me, but let us know. Tell us
guys,
your.
help me prove Bryce wrong, please. Jesus Christ, I need someone to do a front flip and you right hand touchdown, please. So, okay, yeah. I don't know. Like I said, this is still like a very. We're kind of on the edges of what's possible with our trick theory language. And something I've noticed with. Okay. So, for example, when we talked about variations in our variations episode, we didn't really go that in depth in it. We just kind of explained away, like, you can add variations. And that's like the weird outlier in tricking. And it just adds stuff to your stuff. There's no good trick theory format for that. But in reality, I think there actually is. It's just the language to describe it would be so complex, and we don't have that framework yet. In a similar way, I think that's what's happening with hand stuff, with how we're developing it right now. We're just kind of like, oh yeah, like cartwheel, that's like a cartwheel. And like, all these different things that we're coming up with is like very broad generalizations that hopefully we can whittle away at and become better at describing the language. So...
Yeah. And with terms like left touchdown, right touchdown, left touch up, right touch up, the goal is to have something that's short, easy to make into an acronym that you can say and identify, is modular, so that it's not like a whole, sailor for one and touchdown for the other. It's like touch up and touchdown is just more modular. It's easier to stick to other things. It's less ambiguous because you never have to ask anybody, what the fuck does sailor mean? Like none of that ever comes up. And the goal is to eventually have a tricking language that is relatively that way throughout. It's modular. It's got a bunch of pieces like, Tonka toys that you're getting to stick together into finally making your final words and sentences.
Yeah.
So as opposed to this is really the issue with starting from mainstream terminology and then working towards a modular tricking language. Mainstream terminology was based off of giving, nicknames to every individual thing, which is like precisely the opposite of modularity. So
relic head activities. Stop the relic head activities now. So, yeah. I don't know. Do you guys have anything else to add kind of before we close this off? Like, do we hit on everything?
I think I said everything I wanted to say. Anybody who's in the Gumby gang, please let me give me your suggestions for what the second trick in a double Gumby combo is. The first one I think should still be called Gumby, but the second one I think needs a different name.
Oh, if you guys want to start theorizing about this and you want to fuck yourselves up so hard like we did, just try to watch some Alex Hunter clips and describe what the fuck is going on, because I swear to God, there's one time we spent like 2 hours just talking about one Alex Hunter trick.
That was absolutely one of the things that scared the shit out of us for sure. Like, we kept trying to come up with a system that we could use to then give a breakdown of like the weird that Alex Hunter did, and every time we did it we were just like, fuck, our life is so much harder than we thought it was.
It is. It's so hard, but that's why we wanted to get this thing up. This is, and I want to say that this will eventually hopefully be a series. Oh my God, my lisp. A series where we theorize about hand stuff. So this is only the first episode. We're hoping to add more and refine it as we go on. But we wanted to get something out there to just at least get the community talking about hand stuff, because hopefully this will spawn some other tricks that people do, and then we can start describing that, and maybe you guys could come up with really good ideas. So I don't know, we'll see.
I was gonna I don't necessarily have too much more to say about that, other than I am especially interested in what people think about whether hand transitions and foot transitions are fundamentally different, or if they're the same thing. Yeah,
that's an interesting question. I also do want to add that if we accept the existence of hand stuff, we also have to accept the existence of every other part of your body stuff. So that includes taking off your belly, taking off your butt, I don't know, landing on your head. Don't do that. Jesus Christ, don't do that. But so
if not seen Alex Hunter do a knee sideswipe before, go ahead and change your life real quick.
Yeah, knee stuff is potentially a thing. We're not gonna go down those rabbit holes for now. Those are variations, but it's scary. The forbidden book that this opens up when we go down this road. So there's no coming back. All right. Well, if that's it, I think we're done. So we'll catch you guys later. Thank you guys for tuning in.